everyone for joining us today for activating your data across every advertising touchpoint. My name is Michelle Chen, and I'm a product manager on the Adobe Advertising Cloud team. I know you're all probably hitting the lunch lull, probably ready to take a nap. So I'm going to start off with a quick story about myself. When I was about 7 years old, I had a bit of a mild case of OCD. I'd come home from school and have this urge to clean. So I'd go to my room, I would dump all of my belongings in the middle of my room, and I'd start sorting through my clothes, like what I want to keep, what do I want to donate or discard, and then I neatly put everything back in place. I would then anxiously wait for my parents to come home from work, and I'd show them my big accomplishment for the day. At this point, you're probably thinking, this girl is either crazy, or maybe you have kids, and you're like, I wish my 7-year-old did that. Maybe you're like me, and you actually like cleaning or organizing. Maybe you're like my brother, who really only cleans when guests come over. Or maybe you're like my aunt and uncle, who actually only deep clean once a year during Chinese New Year spring cleaning. Regardless of what type of family or person you are, Netflix actually recently launched a show that started a global movement about tidying up and building a framework to help you as individuals be able to clean up your house. Now, how many of you in the audience have either seen or heard of tidying up with Marie Kondo? All right, quite a few of you. Keep your hand raised if you immediately started cleaning after you watched the show. All right, about half of you. If you haven't heard of this show before, take a quick look.
Hello, I'm Marie Kondo. 私のミッションは片付けによって世界をときめかせていくことです。Let's start tidying.
This girl's no joke. This is amazing.
We have too much stuff. It's official.
It's so hard to let it go. I don't want to just, dump it. I want to be thoughtful about it.
Choose items that spark joy for you.
Spark joy. It's not as easy as I thought it was gonna be.
We're on board. We want to change. I just want it to be strong enough to change me.
I can let it go. Arigato.
I am going to figure out what sparks joy in my life.
I can't believe you can touch the carpet.
New day, new joy.
Thank you for being here for us and wanting to help us.
I hope you know how much this means to me.
Here we go.
So you're probably sitting there wondering, what does Marie Kondo have anything to do with activating your data? Bear with me for just one more minute. If you've lived in your home for a while, or maybe you've lived in your house or built a family around your home for the last 5 or 10 years, your garage probably looks something like this. You've probably been hoarding things for a long period of time, thinking, someday I'm going to use that item. But then when that day comes, you go into your garage, and you can't really find the item you're looking for. Organizations in the past have been thinking about data in the same way. They've been collecting first-party data, thinking, let's just collect it all and figure out what to do with it later. In the next 60 minutes, I'd like to encourage you to be a little bit more thoughtful, more intentional about why you're collecting the data you're collecting, and what is it you're doing with that first-party consumer data that is being stored in your servers or in the technology platforms that you're working with. Now, let's take a minute to think about what first-party data you actually own. Take a few minutes, build an internal list in your head, think about all the first-party data your organization might be storing. There's probably website or mobile app analytics data, maybe email marketing data like clicks or open rates, maybe CRM data such as mailing addresses or phone numbers, maybe offline campaign data like direct mail, or call center recordings, or in-store transactions. This is already a pretty long list, but you've probably come up with an even longer list in your head. So it's a lot of data for brand marketers to even think about activating. The thought of trying to figure all of this out, trying to figure out what first-party data to activate for which strategy, probably starts stressing you out, you lack visibility, and this feeling of overwhelming stress starts to take over. And you're really not alone. In a study conducted by Forbes Insights last year, 1/4 of CMOs felt like their teams really didn't have easy access to data. And if they did have access, they weren't really sure if they could trust the data that they were accessing. Harvard Business Review also launched a study last year where half of the marketers in that study felt that the inability to merge data from disparate sources was one of the biggest challenges in achieving their go-to-market goals. So for today, what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk a little bit about how to start tidying up your data strategy in-house and start decluttering your data with 6 different steps that tie back to 3 different themes. The first theme is data collection. Next is data curation or classification. And last is data activation. I'm going to dive deeper into these 3 themes, and then I'm going to have Adam Allamar from Barclays US Consumer Bank come up and talk to you about how his organization was able to simplify and be a lot more intentional and thoughtful about their data framework. Let's start with data collection. So we talked a little bit about the list of first-party data that your organization might own. Now let's think about how are you even going to access that data, right? Where does your first-party data come from? Who are the teams, the departments, the stakeholders that you should be talking to on a regular basis? Who are your data partners in your organization? Do you know the answers to those questions? Here are some examples. Maybe it's the programmatic team. Maybe it's the customer experience or strategy team, perhaps the analytics department, maybe the creative or content creation team, or the email marketing team. What do all of these teams have in common? 2 things, data and technology. They all harness data, they all produce content, and they all activate technology. So it's very important for you as a brand marketer to understand their objectives, their goals, and what tech stack they are using. What happens if their goals don't align with yours? Maybe they complement yours, or maybe they actually contradict your goals. Should there be a particular sequence to activating data between these different teams so you can learn from each other's successes or failures? The risk of not aligning these disparate teams within your organization is really what causes the rise of negative sentiment towards advertising today. Commonly, when I talk to my friends about how I'm in advertising or my relatives about advertising, I'm sure you can relate, but they always blame me for ads following them around the internet. And they always say 2 things. Advertising is either creepy or aggressive. The third probably runner-up word is annoying. So as we start to think about brands wanting to create the best possible experience for their consumers, what does that actually mean anymore? Bombarding your consumer with ads is not an optimal experience. Retargeting someone with a pair of shoes that they've already purchased a month ago is both not cost-effective for your organization, as well as will be seen as annoying. If we've learned anything in the last year, it's that consumers don't want to be tracked, rated, or scored without their knowledge. This really gave rise to the consumer privacy laws we're dealing with today, such as GDPR, California Consumer Privacy Act, and the fact that consumers, such as yourselves, are becoming a lot more aware, a lot more educated about how our personal data is being used by brands. Just like advertisers in the last few years have been demanding transparency from the ad tech industry, your consumers are demanding transparency from the brands that they love, trust, and purchase from. So how are you honoring consumer privacy when it comes to data collection? Do you know the answers to those questions? Are you involved actively in making sure that every data point that you collect is privacy conscious? If you're involved or if you have presence in Europe, then you've probably already embarked on this journey. If you haven't, there's kind of three steps that you might want to think about. First is conducting a privacy gap assessment. Next is building a strong relationship with your privacy or legal team. Become best friends with them. Set up regular check-ins with them. Be aware and updated on what privacy laws are happening in your region or in the regions where you're about to start launching campaigns. And lastly, invest in privacy, focus on data governance, data integrity, and data cleanup. Make sure that you focus on permission-based data collection in your organization. Now, as we think about data governance, it's not just about tagging your first-party data with what's consented and what isn't, and what can be utilized for the purposes that you intend to use it for. It's also about figuring out how to curate your data, right? We talked about the different teams and departments that work with first-party data. Do you understand how they classify their data? If you don't, then it's probably going to be a lot harder for you to access that data or to even know what questions to ask them when you want to activate against that data. As a brand, you'll want to start thinking about a criteria for yourself, a criteria that helps you understand how to classify your data. As Marie Kondo mentioned in her show, she always asks her consumers to raise up a piece of clothing and think about, does this spark joy for you? As a brand marketer, think about the data sets that are available to you. Does it yield ROI? Has it yielded results for a different department that has activated this data in the past? Here are a couple examples of things you might think about. Data integrity, data quality, maybe uniqueness of the data. Can you find this data anywhere else? Data freshness. How long ago was this data collected? How often is this data, is new data being created in these tech platforms that this different departments are working with? And then data usability, data accessibility, and data interoperability. If you cannot seamlessly pass data from one platform to another, then you're going to be facing big challenges with data leakage. Although these are just some examples of variables you might think about, each organization is different. Each organization has different verticals they're targeting, so you may have a completely different set of data, criteria, or maybe a more granular criteria you go off of. Regardless of what it is, just make sure you're clear on what that rubric looks like. Now, as you start to influence the data collection and data curation practice in your organization, you're also going to start uncovering gaps in your first-party data. Although first-party data is the most valuable and probably is going to yield the most ROI for you in upcoming campaigns, there's inevitably going to be scenarios where you're going to need to enhance or purchase data from outside. And when you do, it's not about filling up your shopping cart. In the past, it might have been a reach play where you're just checking boxes to try to increase the number of cookies you're reaching. Today, brands are starting to be a lot more thoughtful, a lot more intentional, and a lot more selective with the partners that they work with. So purchase with intention. When you think about third-party, if you work with DMPs or DSPs, you probably have easy access to third-party audience marketplaces. And as you think through that, make sure you understand the methodology behind the data collection. Make sure you know what you're buying. In a study last year, brands have started shifting away from just purchasing based on quantity and purchasing more based on quality. And most brands are actually only using 1 to 2 trusted data providers for third-party today. We've also seen a rise in second-party partnerships, mostly internationally, but they're happening organically around the world. There's been a 62% usage growth in second-party data. These are partners that maybe you've struck deals with in terms of partners that may sell your products, maybe they're media or affiliate partners. They're partners you trust. You know how the data is collected, you know where it's housed, you know how to access it. So definitely start thinking about those partnerships that you might be able to interact with. And lastly, lookalike modeling. Similar to companies like Stitch Fix or Trunk Club, where maybe working professionals might be using those for personal stylist purposes, they curate a box of clothes for you based off of your preferences and your interests. Lookalike modeling is quite similar to that. Algorithms, machine learning algorithms will curate lookalikes and enhance your first-party data set based on the traits that you select. There's been a 75% rise in growth for lookalike modeling, so if you haven't already, carve out some of your budget to allocate to lookalike modeling testing. Now, lastly is data activation. It's not just that your first-party data is cluttered, it's also that our consumption patterns have started to get really cluttered, right? I'm watching TV, I'm on my phone, I'm on my tablet, I'm probably having Alexa playing in another room. We are very distracted consumers today. So how do you as a brand even manage to reach us and capture our attention? How can you use your data to properly personalize the customer's experience? This marketing funnel right now is pretty traditional up on this slide. I will acknowledge that in 2018, a lot of articles came out talking about how this marketing funnel has evolved. It's no longer really a funnel for certain types of brands or certain types of consumers. Sometimes this funnel looks more like a pyramid, other times a little bit more like an hourglass. If you've ever been on Instagram and been retargeted with an ad on Instagram, sometimes you just click to purchase without even knowing who the brand is. But for the purposes of thinking through how to leverage your data at each stage or each type of strategy, let's talk about awareness first. When we think about brand awareness, we usually go with something that's more immersive, an ad format that will strike at your emotions, typically sight, sound, and motion-related ad formats, such as connected television, mobile video, desktop video, maybe digital out-of-home. And we'll start with something a bit broader, such as contextual targeting or selective third-party data. As we move down the funnel to the consideration phase, we'll probably start testing social, maybe native, maybe audio, and this is where you start leveraging your first-party data set that you own in your organization. First-party site or ad engagement data, maybe second-party data that you've struck deals with, or third-party partnerships. And all along, excluding existing consumers so that they don't get annoyed. As you move into conversion, it's purely a first-party data play, with perhaps converter lookalike enhancements, and maybe dynamic creative optimization. You might do creative A/B testing to make sure that your customer or your potential customer doesn't get ad fatigue. And lastly, in the loyalty phase, it's a pure first-party retargeting phase, purchase strategy. And you'll focus on retargeting your loyal brand customers with loyalty offers, renewal reminders, or complementary products or services. But all this would not really be possible without the right team and talent in place. So as you think through these 6 steps that we've talked about around data collection, data curation, and data classification, make sure you're also thinking about your workforce gaps. A study last year called out that marketers felt like 1 in 3 marketers felt that the lack of technology skills in their teams was really stopping them from reaching their marketing goals. 1 in 3 felt that the lack of knowledge and expertise in new channels was also a big gap in their workforce. And 1 in 5 felt that the lack of communication and coordination with the different partners they had to work with was inhibiting them from reaching their goals. So I could go on and talk about these theoretical steps that you might be able to keep and follow, but really what I want to do is bring up Adam Allamar from Barclays US Bank. He was here on stage last year. He talked about how his organization chose a DSP. Today, he's going to come up on stage and talk about how 1 year later, his organization was able to activate data across every advertising touchpoint. Please welcome Adam Allamar from Barclays US Consumer Bank.
Thank you, Michelle. Can you guys hear me okay? Yes, all right. Great presentation and lots of concepts we're going to be touching on. My name is Adam Allamar. I'm the head of digital acquisition at Barclays. To Michelle's point, I was here last year presenting a proof of concept that we did with Ad Cloud and Audience Manager. But before we deep dive into our story, quick show of hands, how many of you guys think you're already doing a good or a great job activating data in your digital channel? I see like 3 hands. That's a good starting point. How many of you now have some level of technology, MarTech and AdTech, to enable you to do that? DSP, DMP. That's about 30%. That's great. So what I thought we could do today is walk you guys through a journey that we've taken. And that journey started 10 years ago, back in 2009, which feels like a long, long time. We'll talk a little bit about Barclays and the Digital Consumer Bank. We'll talk about how we started implementing the tech stack. Because I think it's very important to understand why we made the decision that we've made in 2018 and 2019, down to, I'm sure a lot of you guys are asking yourselves questions like, is Ad Cloud the right technology? Is Audience Manager the right DMP? Should we go full stack or best of breed? All the questions that we were asking ourselves about 2 years ago. We'll talk a little bit about a use case we have in market around the activation of the data. And then we'll talk about key learnings, what's ahead of us, but also what's keeping us awake at night. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but Barclays Bank US, 327-year-old out of the UK. We're fairly small in the US, nimble, but growing fairly significantly. You may know us through some of the relationships we have with some of our co-brand partners. So chances are, if you carry any of these credit cards in your wallets, these are actually brought to you by Barclays. So it's a white-labeled experience on the back end. My team essentially manages all of the acquisition, the ECM. We work very closely with our analytics team, credit fraud. So essentially, that is the bank that's powering a lot of these value proposition. And I would say about 2 years ago, we've actually embarked on more of a branding exercise, essentially putting our logo and our brand on our own product. So your typical savings and deposits line of business, consumer loans, credit cards, and then checking. But that's enough about Barclays. Let's talk about the challenge we were faced with about 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, conversation with our media agency will go something like this, right? We're about leveraging about 10 to 15% of all of our digital acquisition volume through the digital channel. So digital was what I would qualify more of a hobby. Digital was more of a response channel, right? And the conversation with the media agency quickly morphed into how can we actually be front and center where our customers are expecting us to be. Across paid media, across owned media, shared and earned media, but how can we put data front and center in everything we do? How can we make sure that whatever the agency is executing is actually also in line with our strategy, right? So like any financial institution, we sit on a lot of CRM data, offline data, PII data, online footprint data, some PII, some non-PII, some site-side data, but the agency was essentially operating in a silo. So use case would be, and again, we're 100% performance marketer at Barclays, would be something to the effect of, I have X to spend, I want the agency to generate Y account at a specific CPA. The agency will take that brief, run with it, and essentially try to recreate those audiences, leveraging third-party data, when in fact, we were sitting on quite a bit of first-party data, right? But you couldn't action against that. We didn't have the processes, we didn't have the technology, we didn't even have the mindset of the culture that said, we're going to start with what we know about the customer, whether it's about prospecting or cross-selling. So essentially about 4 years ago, we hit the reset button with the agency. From a relationship perspective, from an interaction model perspective, I'll talk about how that model essentially evolved. But before we do that, a quick background in terms of 2009. So like most issuers, 2009, we had Adobe Analytics, some Google Analytics implemented. We were generating funnels left and right. We were excited, access to data. We're starting to get an understanding of who essentially is showing up to the party, who's converting, who's not. It wasn't at the customer level. It wasn't at the segment level. It wasn't at the device level. It was at the channel level, but it was still very exciting data. So I will take that data, run it to my UI UX team and said, hey, you know what? The application has 23 fields. We know that this specific field number 5 and 6 are actually driving the biggest drop-off. What can we do about that? So great starting point to being able to storytell my way into building a channel. 2014 and 16, we implemented Target and Adobe Experience Manager. I'll talk actually about implementing versus integrating. A little bit of semantics, but when you talk to Adobe and when we talk about the MarTech and AdTech, there are so many different flavors of how to implement a tool. So a DMP and a DSP are probably one of the best examples, right? So you can implement the two tools separately. You can actually tie the two tools through use cases, which we ended up learning our way into that. So if you were going to take one thing out of today's session, and we'll talk about when we do the reminder at the end of today's session, is when we first came in, we were trying to be a little bit too aggressive. Having that use case, we went back and said, you know what, this isn't just about implementing the technology or the tool, it is about trying to solve for customer problems. And I know it sounds such an obvious thing, right? We're all here to try to solve for a customer problem, but the MarTech and the technology implementation and the use case had to actually follow through that. 16 and 17 was about optimizing what I call the office experiences, recognizing that because we don't have a retail footprint in the US, our retail footprint is essentially our digital storefront, or Barclays US.com. We essentially had to fast forward our way into being able to target audience. We onboarded LiveRamp as a partner, and then we started thinking about optimal ways to essentially tag our pages, hence the little Adobe Launch or DTM logo on the page. So 4 needs actually emerge out of this process. One, we're having more and more conversations with the agency, but I felt like the conversation was going back to third-party data, when I was sitting, again, on a lot of CRM, first-party data, so not being able to action against that. 2, we wanted to see a little bit more transparency in what the agency was doing. How they were planning, buying, optimizing, trading, and then essentially charging us for that service, right? So a little bit more granularity when I was getting that invoice saying, I'd like to understand what you guys are working on and what you're delivering for our business. 3, wanted to make sure that whatever our agency was doing, whatever Barclays was doing, was inventory agnostic. And I have to be very careful with that because we've had at times a campaign that had 5, 6, 7 different DSPs. Hey, more inventory, more audiences, faster way to get us to where we need to be. But then you run into ad collision, you run into viewability challenges, and that I wouldn't call that a more efficient approach. So as part of the lesson learned, when we made that choice about Ad Cloud, we actually mandated, and I know it's a strong word, but we mandated that our agencies start trading on one single DSP platform. And by the way, they weren't trading on that. So part of the lesson learned, you have to be joined to the hip with your agency, they have to be sold on your agenda, and you have to have great collaboration and partnership, which we do today at Barclays. And then last but not least, I had to throw this one in because it sounded cool in 2018, the notion of omni-channel and multi-channel. So we're like, hey, you know what? We're going to launch campaigns. We're going to be omni-channel. It sounded great. It was great PowerPoint material. But when it was all said and done, we were not able to actually deliver a consistent experience. So let me explain what that means. A consistent experience would be, I'm trying to sell you a product, and then across all of your devices, all of the digital touch points, I'm driving the same message. But beyond that, I have the analytics on the back end to figure out some basic use case. You started the story in device A, you're consuming content there, you're jumping to device B, I'm targeting you over device B, and then you're converting on device C. That's the most basic use case. That's creating actually a lot of synergies, right? Think about the power of being able to understand what device do you carry in your pocket to snack on content versus what device actually do you take on to convert. You start building that level of analytics. You start to actually build segments, right? Folks who actually leverage device A or those type of OSs or screen sizes or type of experiences to essentially convert versus learn more about the product. It's a work in progress. I don't think we have it all figured out yet. But I'll tell you what, being able to ask the right questions is half of the answer, right? And that's half of the battle. So 2018, we realized the current model isn't working. We need a DSP. So we went through a fairly rigorous exercise. If you want to know more about, if you're in that state of the process, you're trying to understand where do I start, what DSP do I pick, how do I go full stack versus best of breed. Last year's presentation actually touches on that, and it has a couple of scorecards, so I think you'll find it very, very useful to go back to that material. But as we're having those conversations, and as I'm actually sitting in this building in one of these rooms, I was asking myself the following question. One, is Ad Cloud the right technology, right? So we're having conversation with the Adobe sales team, right? And then they put us in touch with clients, and then we were benchmarking, but I was still very concerned about introducing a piece of technology that potentially will be disruptive. Two, is the integration. You notice I'm using the word integration, not implementation. Is the integration as seamless as Adobe claims to be? Three, do I need to staff the agency differently, right? New tool, new technology, push back potentially from the agency, retrain, retool, lose momentum, not be the most popular person at the agency type of thing. How would I manage through that? Four, do we have the right team in place at Barclays, right? So, and I'll tell you a little bit of a spoiler alert. 5 or 7 years ago, I used to bring to the team folks who were good marketers with a passion or an interest for data and technology. Today, it's actually the other way around. We've completely rehauled our hiring and recruiting plans. Today, we're looking for folks who have depth of expertise in technology. It doesn't have to be the Adobe stack. It can be any type of MarTech or AdTech who are obviously passionate and have a little bit of interest in learning about marketing. Because I'll tell you, 95% of what we do is around data and around technology. And then, last but not least, we have a global agency deal, I would say, that cuts across multiple regions, across the board. Was this essentially going to change our interaction model with the agency? Did I have the right team in place? Did I have the right structure even from a compensation perspective, right? I had a retainer in place. Did I still need a retainer? Were those resources fungible? So lots and lots and lots of questions. So we're in 2018, but I wouldn't be here today if the POC did not have a happy ending. So I'm not going to touch on every single one of these, but I'll pick on two, actually. I'll pick on the unified marketing strategy. So typical campaign at Barclays prior to 2018, we align on the target audience at a high level. The agency takes the brief, runs with it, start building third-party segments across display, across social. Does some paid search retargeting. Look at the performance on the back end, not doing well. Today, everything we do starts with first-party data. I'll talk about the process, but essentially, we onboard the data from Axiom through LiveRamp deterministically. We'll talk about match rates that we're seeing today. We'll talk about DSP find rates and how we're actually trying to test our way into that. Two, being able to actually tell a story. Go back to my leadership and saying, here's what's truly happening. So I'll give you a couple of use cases that I think you may be able to relate to. So we'll have weekly paid media optimization campaigns, and then during these weekly optimization campaigns, if things were going great, we're meeting our CPA and KPI targets, we're booking accounts, the agency will be high-fiving and taking credit for that, right? I'll be having the same conversation with my target team, and if our landing page optimization test, A/B and MVTs were doing great, they'll be high-fiving, they'll be excited, they'll be taking credit for that. We'll be having the same conversation with the analytics team. If SEO is doing great, we'll be like, we really have a kick-ass experience. But when things weren't pointing in the right direction, there was a lot of finger-pointing, right? So what Ad Cloud and what we've been able to build across the board is enabled us to do is go back to the basics. I'm going to create a first-party data segment. I'm going to activate that segment, leveraging LiveRamp, and sometimes onboard that segment directly into a publisher like Facebook. So from a PII to non-PII match, we're seeing anywhere between 40 to 60% deterministic match rate. It's a good performance, but we'll talk about our agenda in terms of improving that. And then we take those audiences, and now those audiences sit in a data management platform. So I have a bunch of devices, non-PII, a bunch of cookie IDs, and now my team has access to that. They can slice and dice it, create segments. Not only that, but also start onboarding data out of Adobe Analytics, retargeting pools. We can do things like create segments of customers who are now annoyed with us because we know we've served them 15 impressions, viewability is decent, and we know that at the 15th impression, that point of diminishing return, we're there, they're not going to convert. We have the analytics on the back end. We're going to do one of two things. We're going to stop serving them an ad, or we are going to actually sequence maybe a different product. Or we're going to leverage DCO to make it a little bit more exciting, right? Again, learning our way into those mechanics of how do we make sure that we're not wasting impressions. So 2018, we've implemented all these tools. I'll have a 2019 view. Coming out of this conversation, I also want to make sure you guys don't think that we've been able to have some level of success because we had every single product almost that Adobe sales implemented, right? That's not the case. And I want to bring a balanced view. This has been a journey. Clearly, it's taken us 10 years. It's with lots of peaks and valleys. We couldn't have done this without the team at Barclays, but also the agency and Adobe. But as we sat in 2018, we said, we have a DMP, we have a DSP, where do we go next? So the first conversation we had to have was with our creative agency, with our media agency. We've had quite a bit, actually, of conversation, also with the creative agency. But the traditional media model to your left is, on the Barclays side, we own the marketing strategy, UI, UX, so primarily landing page, the forms, the application form, the native app, and then the back-end performance. And the agency was delivering on everything else. They own the data strategy, primarily third-party. They own all of the trading, UI, UX optimization from a DCO perspective, paid media, etc. They also own all of the DSP management, and I put an S at the end of DSP, so multiple DSPs. That model with Ad Cloud morphed to the right, which is my team now in control of what I think is critical to our success story. So marketing strategy, one DSP, it's called Ad Cloud. And I'll double click on that because I think it's important. When we did the POC, actually, we had two POCs running in parallel. The first one was, I'm going to take Ad Cloud, I'm going to give that tool and the DSP to the agency, get them to get trained, provide them with the level of support, have them trade on that, and see if we're getting better performance. Use case number one. Use case number two was, I'm going to actually have the agency do what they're doing, but I'm going to take the technology, put it in the Ad Cloud managed services team, give them a project, and give them a partner. So back to the first couple of slides where I said, these are our partners. So we tested that actually with Uber. We told the Ad Cloud team, here's Uber, here's the value proposition, here's what we're trying to do. So I'll go through that use case. So two POCs running in parallel. It was actually fascinating to see same technology, same setup, two different approaches. One agency where I was trying to retool them and retrain them in terms of embracing that. The other agency already sold on the technology. I had to train them on how to sell credit cards, right? So a fascinating use case in terms of change management. So bullet number two, coming out of today's conversation, don't underestimate the change management piece and the retraining and the socialization. Looking back, I think I could have done a better job instead of having that vision, just selling it to my team, spend a little bit more time and be relentless about my storytelling, which, by the way, on a personal note, I also had to work on my storytelling, right? I used to go from, I can book X million of accounts to, ta-da, here's the technology, right? So technology is irrelevant, right? It's an enabler. And I know it sounds cliche, but we've actually pulled back as a team. We don't talk about DSPs and DNPs and all that cool stuff. We talk about, here are the 5 business problems I'm trying to solve on behalf of customers. Here's why these are the right challenges on the back end, right? Tying it to the P&L. And here's how technology is going to enable us to succeed. This is where we stand in 2019. You see a little bit of a chart. This is kind of representing the value we've gotten out of the stack. Anything in red and yellow is not good. Anything in green is what I tend to take credit for and remind my boss that I'm doing a great job. So as we sit here in 2019, Barclays, the Advertising Cloud team, all of the stack we've talked about. And then the next section, we'll talk about how we've essentially, now that we've built the house, how we're going to throw the best party out there and people excited and engaged, okay? So here we go. Nothing groundbreaking about data activation. It's an easy 6-step process, right? You align on the approach, you set up your testing agenda, you define and classify the data, you map your data sources, you launch, you test, measure, iterate, and you celebrate or not. And then you do it all over again. But I'll tell you, before we implemented that cloud, before we actually embraced this end-to-end momentum, I, on a personal level, used to over-index on step 1, 2, 5, 6, and then 6, 6, 6, 6, 6 to try to iterate, but skipping very important parts of the process because those two critical pieces were essentially owned by the agency. So it was a little bit of a naive approach on my part. So as part of the process, we now have access to the data. We can activate the data. We can activate segment and tell those segments what experience. I can craft the story they're going to be seeing. I can sequence that. I can measure it on the back end. It's not perfect, but I'm in control. So now we're spending quite a bit of time talking about 3 and 4. The good news is we've done such a great job over-indexing on the rest that we don't need to do a lot of work, but now we need to roll up our sleeves and really have the hard conversation around data. So what I'm going to do in the next, I would say 10 minutes, is just walk you through the different steps and some of the things that we've learned along the way. So step 1, aligning on the approach. We actually rewrote our media briefs. And I know it sounds super tactical, but part of it, unless you know what you're trying to march toward, it's challenging for the agency to even absorb that information, let alone execute on your strategy. So step 1 has to start with the first-party data. So again, we mandated, strong word, we mandate for the agency to always start with a first-party segment, right? So data sitting at Axiom, uploaded through or onboarded through LiveRamp, and then action again to that. 2, we started talking a little bit more about format, screens, in trying to deliver that omni-channel experience. 3, looking at what those experiences were going to be served. 4, as I mentioned earlier, we had a tendency to over-index on technology, but we made it a point to actually make it on everyone's goal. So everyone on my team has to be able to map the architecture. That's the basic expectation, right? We know why we're leveraging a DSP. It's part of the narrative, right? But we cover this sometimes on a weekly basis, right, in staff meeting. Here's why we're doing this, right? So being relentless about the vision, but also starting with the end result. We're doing this because blank. These are our goals. This is what we're solving for from a customer experience perspective. And then performance is key, right? And that's the difference between driving a bunch of activities versus output, right? Everything we've talked about so far is setting us up for that big party we want to throw, but at the end of the day, if no one shows up, if they're not engaged, if they're not excited, these are just activities. It's a cost center. So how do we turn that cost center into a revenue center and a profit center, hopefully? We also had to formalize our test and learn use case. So I mentioned earlier, personal lesson learned, I wanted to boil the ocean. I'm like, this is great. This is going to be the same solution across the board. We had to pull back a little bit and said, what are the top 15 use cases we have in market? Great. Which one are the most critical ones? Here are the top 10s. Which one are the really critical ones? 7. Which one are essentially paying everyone's salary? And then we landed on a set of 4 or 5, and these are the 4 or 5s that we're relentless about pursuing, right? And everyone within the organization, as well as on the Adobe side and the agency side, brings back those 5 or 6 use cases. We also implement the closed loop measurement. So for the most part, a multi-touch attribution. We'll talk about a couple of different nuances of and how we've done that, either leveraging Ad Cloud, but also leveraging a third party that we have in place or in the process of implementing. And then last but not least, we had to take a hard look at the staff, skill set, numbers, areas of focus, process around data. how we collect data. Can we use that data? To Michelle's point earlier, spending quite a bit of time of doing some internal cleaning, and at times just hitting the reset button and saying, we're going to build something from scratch. Here's what I need to be successful in this channel. And then my favorite topic is privacy and governance these days. So we essentially had to also onboard and bring together our privacy team, right? We had to educate them on the digital space and the different nuances, right? And have them to have a little bit more appreciation for what the team was doing. So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of storytelling. It's a lot of, essentially at times, hearing yourself talk in the back of your head, but getting your message across around, this is how we're approaching it. The other thing that we did was implement what we call the 70-20-10 approach. Where essentially think about being able to de-risk your media spend, right? So if I have $100 every day that I can spend to acquire a customer, making sure that $70 out of that $100 is actually spent toward activities that have a certain level of certainty from an outcome perspective. So I'll give you an example. If in the past we've done branded paid search campaigns, and we have a list of keywords and match types that we know are performing, that will be a good candidate for 70, right? So I will classify that at 70. 70 activities pay everyone's salary, essentially. We're not taking any risks. The 20% or 20 cents on the dollar, these are activities that, or tactics, or strategies that may have worked in the past, and we need to refresh, or may have worked for a different product that we need to bring in and port to a different product. So we may have tested something on the deposit side, worked well. Let's try to see if we can get to that level of success. And then the 10 cents on the dollar, or the 10%, is pie in the sky type of exercises, right? It's the one where you're trying to solve for big rocks, but those big rocks won't come to fruition until maybe a year or two from now. So a good example would be, I need to improve my match rate, PII to non-PII, and take it, let's say, from 60% to 80%. So I'm going to be pouring in some additional dollars, and those additional dollars are going to come out of the 10%. So 70%, there is a CPA attached to that. If we're not making our numbers, we're shutting down those tactics. 20%, we're having conversations with the agency. How can we actually optimize to bring it into the 70% bucket? 10% is go out and spend it, but tell me what are the 3 things you're going to learn out of that exercise. No CPA attached to that, right? And which, by the way, is a little bit of a mindset shift also for the organization. Telling finance we're going to be spending all this money just to learn, right? Good luck with that conversation. But I think we've gotten to a good place, right? Kind of showcasing a learning agenda. The other thing that I say we were essentially skipping prior to that is understanding and formalizing our data classification. And I think that's a very, very important exercise. So as you embark on this journey, or you may already be in there, think about what PII data you collect, why do you collect it, how can you monetize it and leverage it. Think about the type of targeting that you can do on-site versus off-site, and think about what personalization means, right? Because that's a word that's very often misused. So I'll give you a couple of examples. A personalization could be, for one of our partners, depending on where you are physically located, where your IP address is pinging, we may show you a different background on a landing page. It's an example of personalization. Another use case could be sequencing different ads through DCO. The more sophisticated level of personalization is what I described earlier, being able to actually sequence our story and storytell our way across multiple devices per user in a controlled fashion, right? So being able to actually take a piece of paper and write down what does personalization mean to the organization, and then what does it mean in terms of ROI. We spent also quite a bit of time, and I will tell you this is a work in progress, talking about DMP data classification, right? Enterprise data, first and second party data, site-side data, which, if you remember 2009, we were really good at producing funnels. Not a whole lot of insights, but really good at collecting that. So how can we take that data? How can we take folks who have bounced out of the landing page and serve them an ad? Folks who have started an app and retarget them maybe across a different device and bring it all together within that DMP. And then last but not least, and probably my least favorite topic today, which is third-party data, because I think we've over-indexed on that piece. How can we leverage third-party data as an overlay? Traits, right, to try to refine the strategy. But if your strategy is all about bucket number 4, it's all about creating those segments, it's all about trying to learn your way into that. We've tried that, that never works. What works is you tend to run out of budgets pretty quickly, and you don't have a whole lot to show for. So we've learned our lesson. So we start with first-party data. We augment it with second-party handshakes. We look at site-side data and that behavior, and we try to essentially build that segmentation and that the customers we're going to go after. So we know what data we're going to be leveraging. Now we need to think about where that data will be pushed. So I touched on some of these things. The DMP, we happen to have Audience Manager as a DMP. We work with some partners that have different DMPs, Crux, just to name one, and then that requires an additional level of data integration, which, by the way, when we think about going full stack versus best of breed, the decision we made as an organization was essentially to build a stock car, not a race car. I don't have the type of technology support or SI budget to be able to essentially tie all of these pieces, and I'm getting the best analytics and the best DSP and the best DMP, and I'm building this race car. At this point, I don't need that. I need a stock car so that when it breaks, I can call Adobe and it can help me fix it. And that's been a little bit also of a paradigm shift across regions, right? If you were to talk to my counterparts in the UK, they may have a different approach because they have different needs. So figure out whether full stack versus best of breed is the right approach for you. Analytics, we've talked about that quite a bit, but essentially making sure that not only we know why we're collecting, we know what we're going to do with the data, how we're going to monetize it, and making sure that we're obviously operating in control. So every single data point in the funnel, you should be pointing at it and saying, why are we collecting this, right? And if you can tie it back to the overall goal, then you should question yourself why you're collecting that data. And then from an experience perspective, so we have the technology layer sitting in behind. You obviously need to have products, so we had to go back and rethink our product strategy. We had to go back and rethink our UI, UX experience, trying to tie it across the ad cloud. We've touched on this briefly, but that's just one way of onboarding the data, PII to non-PII, essentially Axiom and LiveRamp. So you start with a first-party data feed that sits at Axiom. And then for all intents and purposes, the agency doesn't touch that data. We don't touch the data. And Adobe doesn't touch the data, right? Because that's PII. I will also suggest, if you haven't had those conversations with your legal and compliance team, to again meet with them and have them help you define what PII means. Because PII under CCPA and under GDPR has a very different meaning than PII from a publisher perspective. So have that laundry list, make sure you're PII compliant. So we onboard that through LiveRamp, and then we activate it through Audience Manager. We've actually had a use case where we activated the data directly into Ad Cloud, which you can do it potentially faster, but there's a trade-off on the back end in terms of, again, going back to that ultimate source of truth. So if you're sitting in your chair today and you're thinking, I can only buy one product, or I can only buy one technology, is it a DMP or a DSP? I would say from the value that we've gotten out of the tool, I would say the data management platform, right? Because that's put us in control at least of our data, and that's our starting point. And then we can work our way into potentially other DSPs, but that's the foundation. This is the complicated slide. I'm not going to go through every single box, but, and we're actually, Michelle and I were having this conversation. Do we show something that's super complex, lots and lots of box and connections to sound really cool? Or do we show a one box that says we're really good at measuring? So I went with option one, hoping to build some credibility with you guys. So here we go. So direct mail and digital are the channels, obviously. We plan for those campaigns. Different level of sequencing, at times different agendas. Think about, and that's my challenge today, going from a direct mail, offline type of environment into online, highly predictable channel. Data gets onboarded through Audience Manager and then through Adobe Analytics, so different flavors of data. And then essentially we pass that data to the agency to activate it through our media. And then on the back end, there's that feedback loop. And the feedback loop can be a couple of different ways. Basic, which is looking at last click data and reverse engineering those interactions. It could be taking some solutions out of the Ad Cloud package, like a pathing analysis, an opener and a closer analysis. Gives you a good sense of what channels are really doing the heavy lifting in terms of creating that awareness and what channels are essentially taking credit for that. But at any point, we'd like to leverage multiple sources of data. So last click, analytics data, it's pixel-based, so you know for the most part that that pixel fired, and it's a smiley face, meaning we drove the conversion, or it's a frowny face, meaning we didn't drive the conversion. So you can starting to get essentially from a last click perspective to your Adobe Analytics deltas in terms of volumes and CPA. At times, we've also leveraged ad server data. We've leveraged multi-touch attribution data, leveraging third-party solutions, and now we're in the process of building our own solution internally. So it's a journey. The way I look at it is I'm going to get 5 data points that are going to be highly imperfect, but at least I'm going to be able to triangulate my way into that ultimate source of truth. And just to double-click a little bit on that topic, MTA essentially helps us solve 2 things. Helps us solve how many accounts did we truly book. So we'll have our weekly optimization call. My last click report will show 250 credit card accounts booked, let's just say hypothetically. And then the agency will be getting on a call and claiming they had booked 500 accounts, right? So there was that healthy debate. Well, I'm pretty sure it's 250 because that's the number of credit card we've embossed. And then the agency will be like, well, but you know, really, we've actually driven a little bit more momentum. So being able to actually get to that ultimate source of truth, but also talking about geography, what channels are actually driving the most volume and why. We're also embarking on a journey to essentially focus on, you know, what everyone calls people marketing or people measurement, essentially being able to device stitch our way into our acquisition goals, right? So it started a few weeks back. We implemented the Adobe Device Co-op. We're having conversations, and we've actually implemented also the Smart Reach solution to enable us to essentially get a better match rate, PII to non-PII, but also match users to their devices. So the Device Co-op is fairly new. We had to actually change our privacy policy on our website. We had to convince our friends from Privacy and Compliance that this was the right thing to do. If you haven't done that, I suggest you at least consider having a device stitching solution because that's ultimately is going to help you essentially tie the story across multiple devices. Back to my use case example earlier, we actually have a device stitching use case. And that use case is when somebody converts across one of the multiple devices, we should do one of 2 things. We either mute the impression, meaning we don't serve them ads, or we take that opportunity to serve them an ad for a different product, maybe too soon, I don't know, we're testing that, or we don't serve them an acquisition ad, we serve them an existing customer marketing ad. So something to the effect of, hey, congratulations, without sounding too creepy, back to Michelle's point, congratulations, you just bought this product, it's time to activate, it's time to fund this loan, et cetera, right? So enabling you to tell your story. So very quickly, the use case that I wanted to share with you is a great success story. And it's a success story around Uber, right? So we launched this partner a little over a year ago, fairly new relationship, right? Had to build credibility with them. The team at Adobe, as well as the team at Barclays, essentially took on this challenge around two things. One, creating audiences that were Uber-based audiences, essentially being able to access Uber data, ridership data, and being able to activate a credit card program embedded into the native app. So the goal is, when we think about mobile first or native first, it doesn't get better than this, I think, right? This is really embedding the experience within the native app environment, but also being consistent and coordinated across the multiple touch points. Whether it's Uber.com, BarclaysUS.com, whether it's programmatic targeting or retargeting, as well as paid social. And we've seen some great results. So 5x increase in our targetable audience. Again, targetable audience in terms of number of people, but also well-qualified audiences. 25 to 60% increase in account volume, and we kept the range fairly wide because this depends on the different tactics we had in place, and then 20 to 50% decrease in CPA. So very, very powerful use case. We've been very happy with the performance, to say the least. So very quickly, I know we're running out of time. I'm going to actually fast forward the 6 bubbles. Get your analytics processes in shape. We've talked about that. Starting small, growing in control, assessing and right-sizing the team, both in terms of numbers, area of focuses, as well as skill set. Formalizing the vision and being relentless about actually selling that vision across the board and at all levels. And then also, last but not least, leveraging a use case approach, as I mentioned earlier. What keeps us awake at night? I'm only going to double click on the first one, which is the state and federal data privacy law. GDPR was good because it was a law where at least everyone, all the European countries, knew what to do, right? Now we have CCPA happening January 1st, 2020. We're going to find our way into a situation where each state essentially are voting their own privacy laws. And then very quickly, what's exciting, I'll only touch on one piece, which is trying to essentially build a case on how branding is going to essentially drive our direct response within the funnel. And now I'm going to hand it over to Michelle, and she'll wrap us up with key takeaways.
Thank you, Adam.
There we go.
Thank you. So thank you, Adam, for sharing the Barclays data and technology journey. I know we're out of time. I'm just going to leave you with one quick takeaway. If you do anything in the next 2 weeks, start tidying up now. Set up time with your privacy team and your data stakeholders in your organization and start having that conversation. Just like Marie Kondo encouraged you to clean your room, I'm hoping that this session will have encouraged you to at least start thinking about those 6 questions you should know the answers to. Thank you so much for your time.